That man stood at the head of the boardroom table, black suit, steel eyes, and signed off on 12 layoffs without blinking once. The entire city knew the name Daniel Crawford, cold, precise, and quietly dangerous. But that morning, when he walked through his own front door, his 8-year-old daughter stopped him cold in the hallway with a single sentence. "Daddy," Sophie said, looking up at him with those wide, serious eyes. "The mail lady asks about you every single day. She says you look really sad." Daniel stood there with his briefcase still in his hand, the hum of the house around him, and for the first time in 2 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. The house on Birchwood Lane was the kind of house that made people slow their cars down as they drove past. Wide front porch, old oak trees lining the driveway, a mailbox that Sophie had painted herself in the second-grade lopsided sunflowers, and one very optimistic rainbow. From the outside, it looked like the kind of home where good things happened. Inside was a different story, though nobody on Birchwood Lane was close enough to Daniel Crawford to know that, and he had taken considerable care to keep it that way. Daniel had built Crawford Logistics from a 2-truck operation in a rented warehouse outside Columbus into a regional powerhouse with contracts across 7 states. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been warm. Once people who knew him before sometimes said, "That careful to add the word," before the way you'd add it to a weather report about a town that got hit by something it didn't see coming. His wife Laura had been the weather in that town. The good kind. The kind that made everything grow. She died on a Thursday afternoon in October 2 years ago, when a distracted driver ran a red light on Elm and 5th. She had been on her way to pick Sophie up from school. Daniel had been in a meeting that he had promised to leave early. He didn't leave early. That was the arithmetic of it, and it lived in his chest like a stone he had stopped trying to move. Sophie was 8 now, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of going quiet when something mattered. She had adjusted to their life the way children adjust to most things, by finding the edges that were still soft and pressing close to them. She ate her cereal every morning at the kitchen island, while Daniel drank his coffee standing up. She did her homework at the dining room table while he worked in his office with the door half open.
She had learned not to ask about Mom, not because Daniel had ever told her not to, but because she was a perceptive child who understood that some doors in a house are closed for a reason, even when no one locks them. The thing about Megan Ellis was that she had not wanted the Birchwood Lane route at all.
It was too spread out, too many long driveways, and the residents had a reputation for being the kind of people who complained to the post office about delivery times the way other people complained about the weather, as though someone somewhere owed them better. But her regular route on the east side had been temporarily reassigned, while a new sorting facility came online. And so one Monday morning in March, Megan pulled her mail truck up to the first box on Birchwood Lane with a thermos of cold coffee and a general attitude of resigned professionalism. She was 37 medium height, with the kind of practical ponytail that suggested she had made peace with the fact that her job involved weather. Her husband Greg had died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be, leaving her with a 10-year-old son named Jake, a mortgage she had refinanced twice, and a very clear understanding that self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. She was not bitter about this. She was simply honest about it the way people become honest when life stops giving them the option of pretending. She had a good laugh when she used it, which was often enough that her coworkers liked her, and infrequent enough that it meant something when it happened. She met Sophie on her 3rd day on the route. The little girl was sitting on the bottom porch step with her knees pulled to her chest, not playing, not reading, just sitting in the specific still way that children sit when something is wrong and no one has noticed. Megan noticed. She pulled the package from the back of the truck, walked it up the driveway, and set it by the door, then paused. "You doing okay over there?" she asked. Sophie looked up and said nothing for a moment. Then, today is my mom's birthday. Megan didn't make the mistake of saying something cheerful. She sat down on the step next to the girl, dug a peanut butter cookie out of the small bag she kept in her jacket pocket for Jake's after-school pickup, and held it out. Sophie took it. They sat there for 4 minutes without saying much, which was exactly what the situation required. When Megan left, she did something she didn't usually do. She took the small notepad she used for delivery confirmations, tore out a clean page, and wrote, "Sophie, I think your mom must have been someone really special. Special people don't ever really leave." She tucked it under the door of the package. She did not think much more about it, but Daniel found it that evening standing in the kitchen in his dress shirt, with his tie loosened, and he stood there long enough that his coffee went cold on the counter. He didn't throw the note away. He put it in the drawer of the kitchen island under the takeout menus and the spare batteries where he kept the things he wasn't ready to deal with. What he did not know, yet, was that Sophie had already decided, with the quiet certainty of an 8-year-old, who has identified something important, that Megan Ellis was going to be a fixture in their lives. She had just not told him yet. The announcement came on a Friday, the way bad news often does, slipped in at the end of the week, as though the timing might soften it. The regional postal service was reassigning routes as part of a restructuring, and there was a reasonable chance that Megan's temporary placement on Birchwood Lane would end permanently within the month. Sophie heard this from Carol Bennett next door, who had heard it from her daughter, who worked at the distribution center on Route 9. Carol was 71 and had lived on Birchwood Lane for 32 years and considered herself the unofficial historian of the neighborhood. She told Sophie the way she told Sophie most things directly, and while deadheading her roses, which Carol believed was a good activity for difficult conversations. Sophie went straight inside and found Daniel in his office, standing at the window with a report in his hand that he wasn't reading. "Daddy," she said in the particular tone she used when she had decided something was going to happen. "Do you know anyone at the post office? Because Coco Megan might get moved to a different street." Daniel turned from the window and looked at his daughter. He noticed, and it was the kind of noticing that had been missing from his days for a while now, that her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been in a long time. Not desperate, just sure. Sure, the way kids are sure about the things they believe are good. He set the report down on his desk and said he would see what he could do. He made the call that evening after Sophie was in bed. It took 6 minutes and exactly the right combination of tone and implied consequence to convey to the regional manager that maintaining continuity on Birchwood Lane was in everyone's best interest. He hung up and sat back in his chair and thought briefly that he had done something good. He was wrong about how it would land. 3 days later, Megan Ellis knocked on the front door of 14 Birchwood Lane at 7:45 in the morning, which was not her scheduled delivery time. Daniel answered in his work clothes, coffee in hand, clearly 30 minutes from leaving for the office, and Megan handed him the small package she had brought, looked him straight in the eye and said, "I need you to know that I heard what you did, and I need you to not do it again." Daniel opened his mouth. Megan kept going, measured and clear the way a person speaks when they have thought carefully about what they want to say and intend to say at once. "I don't know if you thought you were helping, or if you just couldn't help being the person who fixes things, but I have worked this job for 6 years, and I have never needed anyone to manage my assignments. I keep my route because I do it well, not because someone made a call." Daniel stood in his own doorway with his coffee going warm in his hand and experienced something unfamiliar, the specific social vertigo of being spoken to plainly by someone with no interest in impressing him. His assistant didn't talk to him that way. His board members didn't talk to him that way. Even his closest friend Barrett, who had known him since college, softened the edges. Megan Ellis, 37 years old mail carrier, was looking at him with the calm patience of someone waiting for a response that better be honest. "You're right," Daniel said finally. "I overstepped." Megan held his gaze for one more second, as if taking the measure of whether he meant it. Then she nodded once and walked back down the driveway to her truck. Daniel watched her go, and then closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. He was almost late to work. He didn't care which was unusual enough that he noticed it. Carol Bennett, watching from across the street while pretending to adjust her sprinkler, allowed herself a small smile and said nothing to anyone. The weeks that followed had a texture Daniel hadn't felt in a long time, something low and quiet, and not entirely unpleasant. Megan kept the route. She didn't mention the phone call again. She stopped on her deliveries to talk to Sophie the way she always had, and now occasionally Daniel would be home in the morning, working from the kitchen before his first meeting, and he would see them through the window. Megan crouched down to Sophie's level on the porch steps, talking about something that made Sophie use her hands for emphasis, which she only did when she was excited. He started leaving 2 cups of coffee on the porch railing on the mornings he was home. The first time Megan looked at the cups, and then at him through the screen door, and said, "I already had one." He said, "This is better." She took it, tried it, and said, "It is, actually." That was not a declaration of anything. It was just the truth, which is how most things between them started. Sophie noticed everything, filed it away, and said very little, which meant she was operating at maximum strategic capacity. Victor Hale had worked under Daniel for 11 years. He was 52 with the kind of silver hair and calibrated sincerity that photographed well and read as trustworthy to people who didn't know him well enough. He knew Crawford logistics better than almost anyone alive, and he had spent the past 8 months building a quiet, methodical case to the board that Daniel was no longer fit to lead the company he had built. The case was not entirely dishonest. Daniel had been distant, had made 3 decisions in the past year that were defensively cautious rather than strategically bold, and the emotional weight he carried had left visible marks on his leadership in ways that people who worked close to him had started to talk about in low voices. Victor wasn't inventing the vulnerability. He was simply the one who had decided to use it. The article appeared on a Tuesday. It was not the kind of publication Daniel usually paid attention to, a regional lifestyle magazine that ran profiles of local business owners alongside recipes and real estate features. A freelance journalist had spent several weeks writing about the people who worked in affluent neighborhoods: gardeners, grocery delivery drivers, mail carriers. Megan was one of 4 people profiled. She had spoken openly the way she spoke about most things without performance. She talked about the residents on Birchwood Lane, about Sophie Crawford specifically, about finding the little girl crying alone on her front steps, and what that looked like. She said that the child was clearly loved, but that her father was somewhere very far away, even when he was standing in the same room, and that she thought about that sometimes when she finished her route. She had not named Daniel. She had said, "the little girl's father." That was enough. Victor Hale had the article on his desk, within an hour of it publishing online. By noon, he had forwarded it, with a careful, sympathetic note to 2 board members and 1 investor, who had already expressed concern about Daniel's focus. By 3 o'clock, a gossip-oriented financial blog had connected the dots and published a piece under the headline, "Crawford Logistics, CEO Building, an Empire Missing a Family." Daniel's assistant forwarded it to him without comment. Daniel read it standing at his office window, the same window he'd been standing at, when Sophie told him about the route change. His first instinct was to call his attorney. His second instinct was different, and it won. He called Megan. She answered on the second ring, and before he could say anything measured or strategic, he said, "I need to explain something. Not the article. The reason the article has anything true in it." There was a pause on her end, a real one, not a polite one. Then she said, "Okay," but not on the phone. They met that evening at a diner 2 miles from Birchwood Lane, a corner booth, bad lighting, excellent pie, the kind of place where people have honest conversations, because nothing about the decor encourages performance. Daniel told her about Laura, not the summary version, the real version, the meeting he hadn't left, the phone call from the school that came in while he was still in the conference room, the geometry of guilt that doesn't move no matter how many buildings you acquire or how many contracts you sign. Megan listened the way she had listened to Sophie on the porch steps without filling the space. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Greg died in the spring. My son made me a card for Mother's Day that year that said, 'You're both parents now, Mom.' He was 7. I put it on the refrigerator and cried every day for a week, every time I looked at it. And then I stopped crying, and I still haven't taken it down." Daniel looked at her across the table. The diner smelled like coffee and warm bread, and outside the window, the streetlights had come on against the darkening March sky. "It's still there," he said, not quite a question. "It's still there," she confirmed. They drove home separately, but something had shifted, the specific shift that happens when two people who have been careful discover that the other one is careful too, and decide without saying, so that maybe careful doesn't have to mean alone. The mornings on the porch became reliable. The coffee became a habit they had stopped pretending was not a choice. Sophie, observing from the living room window, with the careful attention of a child who has identified a good development and does not intend to jinx it, told Carol Bennett in a whispered conference across the fence that things were going well, and Carol said, "I can see that, honey," and gave her a snickerdoodle. Victor moved on a Friday because he had the instincts of someone who understood that the end of the week was when defenses dropped. He contacted Megan through a third party. One of his assistants left a card in her mailbox of all places, with a handwritten note asking if she might be available for a brief conversation about the situation. Megan, who did not know Victor and had not been expecting this, agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the distribution center. Victor was polished and careful, and spoke to her with the particular warmth of a man who had spent years persuading rooms full of people. He told her that he was concerned about Daniel, that he'd watched a good man sink in the past 2 years, and that recent events, the article, the scrutiny, certain decisions at the company, suggested that Daniel's recovery, while clearly real, was also possibly being accelerated by external factors that weren't in his genuine interest. He said, and he said it gently, looking at his coffee rather than at her, which was a studied move, that he worried Daniel might be leaning on their relationship, not because he truly wanted to move forward, but because it was useful to his public image at a difficult time. "I'm not saying that's his intention," Victor said. "I'm saying it might be the outcome whether he means it or not, and you deserve better than to be someone's narrative." Megan drove home without the radio on. She sat in her driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. She did not call Daniel. The next morning, she completed her route efficiently, placed Daniel's coffee on the porch railing without stopping, and was back in the truck before he reached the door. He stood on the porch with his own cup, watching the mail truck roll to the next house, and he understood that something had changed. He just didn't know what yet or why. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Sophie came downstairs, took one look at him, and went to make toast, which was her contribution to the household in moments of crisis. She set a plate in front of him and sat across the table. "Did something happen?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Daniel said. Sophie considered this seriously. "Do you want me to find out?" He almost said no. He said, "Not yet." The board meeting was called for a Thursday 3 weeks out. Victor had been working the room for months and had enough votes to force a confidence hearing, not a removal, not yet, but the kind of formal review that sends a message loud enough to shake the stock price and rattle the investors who were already nervous. Daniel's attorney called it survivable. Daniel's COO called it a coup dressed in parliamentary procedure. Daniel himself sat in his home office at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, Laura's photo on the desk in front of him, and thought about the meeting he hadn't left 2 years ago. He thought about how long he had been trying to manage his way out of something that couldn't be managed. He thought about a coffee cup on a porch railing and a mail truck pulling away before he could reach the door. His phone showed no missed calls from Megan. He didn't call her. He put the phone face down on the desk, turned off the light, and went upstairs to check on Sophie, who was asleep with her arm around a stuffed elephant she had owned since she was 2. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep well. None of this would matter soon if he couldn't hold the company together, and none of it would mean anything if he held the company together. And nothing else. He discovered Sophie was missing at 3:47 in the afternoon, when he came downstairs from a call and found her room empty, her jacket gone, and the back door unlocked. He checked the yard, then Carol's house next door, then the small park, 2 streets over where she sometimes went to use the swings. He was systematic about it because panic was a gear he had learned to override. He had a whole engine built on that particular override, but by the time he had circled the block twice, the engine was starting to shake. He called Carol, who had not seen her. He called Sophie's friend, Lily's mother, who said Lily was here. Would she like to talk to Lily? He said no thank you, and hung up and stood on the sidewalk in front of his house with the specific cold clarity of a man who has already lost one person. He loved to an ordinary afternoon and is not willing to do the arithmetic again. He found Megan's address through the delivery manifest he had once had printed for a home renovation project. He drove. He kept the speed legal by a margin that reflected very little actual concern for traffic law. Megan's house was a small blue Craftsman on Alderman Street, with window boxes that needed new soil and a front porch with 2 mismatched chairs and a wind chime that the March air was working on. Sophie was standing on the front step. She was fine. She was completely fine, holding a juice box that Megan had given her, and she looked up when Daniel's car pulled to the curb with the specific expression of a child who has done something that was genuinely necessary and is prepared to defend it. Megan stood in the doorway behind her, and when she saw the look on Daniel's face, not angry, just wrecked with relief, she stepped forward. Sophie looked up at her father and said simply, "I needed to say something." Daniel crouched down in front of her right there on the sidewalk, and Sophie said, "Daddy, Miss Megan is a good person, and you're a good person, and good people shouldn't be lonely just because they're scared." Daniel didn't say anything. He pulled Sophie into his arms and held on, and Megan stood on the top step and watched a father hold his daughter and understand something that all the board meetings and performance reviews and managed recoveries in the world could not have taught him. Whatever Victor Hale had said to her, and she had not told anyone yet what he said, it fell away in that moment, like it was made of paper. The next morning before the business day started, Megan drove to the downtown office of Crawford Logistics and asked the woman at the front desk if she could speak to someone on the board. She was wearing her work clothes. She had not prepared a speech. She had brought a small notebook with 3 things written in it: dates, names, and a description of the conversation at the coffee shop near the distribution center, and she sat across from 2 board members in a conference room that cost more to furnish than her car and told them what Victor Hale had done. Not dramatically, not as a performance. The way she talked to Sophie on the porch, steps directly, and without filling the space with more than was needed. The board members listened. They asked clarifying questions. They thanked her and said they would look into it. She shook hands with both of them and took the elevator back down to the lobby and went and did her route because she had packages to deliver, and nobody was going to do it for her. Victor's access to the building was suspended pending review by the end of that week. The confidence hearing was postponed indefinitely. 3 of the shareholders who had been quietly courted by Victor withdrew their support once the internal communication started coming out in the review. Daniel's attorney called it a clean resolution. Daniel's COO called it the best possible outcome. Daniel called Megan that evening and said, "I heard what you did." Megan said, "I told the truth. That's not really doing something. There was a pause. Daniel said, "It is when the person you're telling it for isn't in the room to tell it themselves." Another pause. Shorter this time. "You're welcome," Megan said. The company meeting happened the following Monday. Not a board meeting, not a shareholder call, but a full staff gathering in the main warehouse on the south side. Daniel stood on the floor level, not at a podium, and spoke to 300 people without notes. He said that the company had been through a difficult season, and that the difficulty had not been only external. He said that he had been operating at less than the person this company deserved at the helm. He said that was changing. He didn't use the words grief or loss or recovery. He didn't need to. 300 people who had worked for him for years already knew the shape of it. What they hadn't known was whether he knew. He knew now. His CFO, who had worked with him since the beginning, caught his eye from the back of the room and gave him the small, specific nod of someone who had been waiting a long time. Megan resigned from the Postal Service in May. She had been sitting on the idea for 3 years, the way you sit on something that feels too good to be possible, until one day you do the arithmetic and realize you have been waiting, not because you couldn't, but because you were afraid of wanting something for yourself. She had enough saved. She had found a small retail space on Chestnut Street, 2 blocks from the elementary school, where Sophie would be starting 3rd grade in the fall. She named it Monday Coffee, because Greg had always said Monday needed defending. Jake painted the sign. It was slightly crooked and entirely perfect. On a Thursday morning in early June, the first week the shop was open, Daniel came in with Sophie before school drop-off. Sophie climbed up on a stool at the counter and asked if she could try a croissant. Megan said she could try half of one. Sophie said the other half was for her dad, which was the kind of negotiating tactic that suggested she had a future in contract law. Daniel ordered his coffee and stood at the counter while the morning light came through the front windows and hit the slightly crooked sign and the 3 small tables with their mismatched chairs. And he said nothing for a moment. He just looked at the room. Then he looked at Megan, who was watching him from behind the espresso machine with the patient direct attention of a woman who had learned to recognize the difference between a person who was performing okay and a person who actually was. She handed him his cup. He took it. And then he did something that Carol Bennett, who happened to walk by on the sidewalk at that exact moment and looked through the window, immediately went home to call her daughter about. He smiled. Not the board meeting smile, not the carefully maintained social expression he had been wearing for 2 years, like a coat he slept in. A real one, slow, a little lopsided, slightly embarrassed, the kind that arrives before you can think to stop it. Sophie looked up from her croissant and went very still, in the specific way she had gone still on the porch steps a few months ago, except that this time it was not grief that made her still. She watched her father's face, and then she climbed down off the stool and walked over and slipped her hand into his the way she used to when she was small, and they were crossing a street together, and she didn't say anything at all. She didn't need to. She had been waiting for that smile for 2 years. It turned out all it needed was the right morning, the right room, and someone who had been paying attention long enough to know it was real when it finally came.